I'll hand it over to Professor Sudhir Krishna to introduce the session and the whole concept of this series, and also our speakers.
Should I start?
Yeah, please start.
Welcome again to our public health seminar series. This is our sixth one in little less than a year. We've really made a very strong attempt to bring very diverse voices from all over the world, but principally from India and Africa. And we've done that, I think, hopefully to give you a sense of how you need very diverse perspectives to work together, to both shape the current pandemic and also to think about leadership in infectious diseases as we go ahead. It's a pleasure and privilege to welcome today's guests and panelists and all of you who are listening. We will start with a poem by Nadir Godrej, who is many things. Many of you probably know him just as an industrialist, but he's actually a linguist. He speaks 6 different languages. He writes poetry. He's well-versed in maths, and he's a lovely and a fun person, and he dances very well. So I think that's a number of accomplishments for one person. And I'll hand it over to Nader, after which Sreejith will host the seminar.
Thank you, Sudhir, for that kind introduction. The coronavirus strikes us all. We don't know who is next to fall. In India, the rise was very fast. For quite some time, it did last. It looked as though we'd lost the race. Some thought we'd be a basket case. Though lockdowns helped to slow the tide, the economy began to slide. In the early days of April, May, all businesses lost their way. But all of us worked with drive. The economy could then revive. There was no way to commute. The managements were astute. Work from home proceeded well. And for the staff, this was swell. But factories must be manned. The employees need to be on hand. Our workers took it very well. In factories, they would dwell. Production started very soon, was in full swing by the end of June. The economy then slowly rose, but still there was much pain, God knows. The migrant workers went away. The COVID cases rose each day. Equipment was in short supply. The manufacturers did try. At first we had no PPE, but soon we reached adequacy. As production rose, we could resort to fill our needs and then export. Our hospitals began to fill, but then we had both will and skill to build hospitals on empty land to comfortably meet demand. For months, we saw the cases climb, and then it turned on a dime. In September, we hit the peak, followed by a downward streak. We've now gone down the sloping trail. We clearly are now in the tail, and yet the tail is rather fat. I also have to admit that the slimming rate is very slow. And though new cases are quite low, and this indeed is a positive trend, though certainly we've turned the bend, strict vigilance is still required, although by now we're very tired. In recent days, there's been a bump. Although new cases should soon slump, now that we are back on track, we pat ourselves on the back. Yes, our response was rather strong. And though it lasted very long, deaths per million were rather low compared to others we do know. The outcome wasn't all that bad, for in the West, it was so sad. No, it wasn't just our policy, but also our demography. A different trajectory was unfurled in parts of the developing world. The African numbers clearly tell that they also performed quite well. In India and its neighbors too, antibodies steadily grew. Without reaching herd immunity, a break point is what we could see. A nation is a real hero when the transmission rate approaches 0. But if the rate is less than 1, most of the job's already done. Then what you get is a tail that's fat, and India can happily live with that. Our seropositivity is quite high. We're not sure exactly why. Many cases were asymptomatic, a good reason to be ecstatic. What could the hypotheses be? for such amazing immunity. One we certainly shouldn't miss is the hygiene hypothesis. A very scholar and disease may have given us fleas. A challenge boosts immunity and thus affords impunity. Another positive that we see is our young demography. Many of us had the BCG, which does protect us from TB, but generally boosts immunity. Any of the above is a possibility, or a combination of all. It's early days to take a call. And there are some who even say it could be in our DNA, the low prevalence of a protein whose absence apparently does mean the virus lacks an entry mode. This is true, it would then bode extremely well for our nation. And now our present situation is steady cases in our nation. Homemade vaccines are now on hand. It's important that we understand that the Atma Nirbhar slogans new, but in vaccines, it was always true. Our industry is very large. Our fine producers soon took charge. 2 vaccines were quickly ready. Production numbers are truly heady. The rollout now is going well. Nor are we selfish, as you can tell. Our neighbors got free supplies. Our government also tries to permit exports, even though we may not have enough to go. We hope the tails that's fat will slow as vaccinations begin to flow. And now rapid viral mutation is the major threat to our nation. New vaccines are the defense, and only these make real sense. Vaccination has a minimal gain against our present milder strain. But for us to be really sure, Dr. Wang Linfa of Singapore opines that vaccinated or not, it counts if the antibodies we've got are tested to be neutralizing. They're the ones we should be prizing. Perhaps it would be best if we were to use his test. The current cost of a test is high, but all the same, we could try to procure a license for this test. The solution that would be the best is to make the test at a cost that's low. That should be the way to go. And T-cell tests are on the way. Yet another way to play. Confirmed immunity and vaccination in a carefully planned combination can indeed protect our nation from COVID-induced depredation. For newer strains that we detect, tweaked vaccines could well protect. And soon I hope a nasal vaccine will appear on the Indian scene. It will be very easy to take and also easy to remake if a booster shot is what we need. With this, we can really succeed. We clearly see the way ahead, so we should prepare instead for new pandemics that could strike. Our healthcare budget we should hike. We cannot grow our people's wealth without proper public health. We should prevent chronic disease and build a system that handles with ease new infections bound to spread. Let's nip them in the bud instead. Our brilliant panel will now expound on good solutions that should be found. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godrej. It's a unique start to the session.
Welcome.
Thank you for the poem. Hi, I am Sreejith. I'll be the moderator for the panel discussion. So initially, I would like to introduce the other panel members. So Professor Chinmay Tumbe, he did his PhD in Economics and Social Sciences. He's currently working as a faculty in IIM Ahmedabad. His research interest is in urban and labor economy and migration studies. He has written 2 books which are very relevant for our discussions today, a book on pandemics and a book on the history of migration in India. We move on to Professor Vijay Chandru. Vijay Chandru is currently with the Center for Biosciences, Biosystem Sciences and Engineering at the Indian Institute of Science, IISc Bangalore. He is an executive advisor for the healthcare to art park. This is an innovation hub in IISc. But he is kind of more famous for the what's called a Simputer, and he is also the founder for Strand Life Sciences. It was one of the leading precision medicine solutions company. And Dr. Gauri Divan is the director of Child Development Group at Sangath as a development pediatrician. She works in the area of early child development, disabilities, and adolescent health. She has done tremendous work in the area of child care and mental health. So for the initial discussion, I would like to invite Professor Chinmay Tumbe and Professor Vijay Chandru for the initial discussion. Welcome aboard. So let me start the session with a question to Professor Tumbe. You have been studying pandemics and have also written a book on it. In your study of the age of pandemics in the 19th and 20th centuries, how did India fare and how did it shape India?
Thanks, Sreejith, and thanks for this kind invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Last March, exactly 1 year to the date, we were in this world where the coronavirus was still picking up. And I would get these very interesting WhatsApp forwards, stuff like, nothing to worry about. India has never suffered from pandemics. Our vegetarian diets will protect us. Just a variety of things. And as someone who has, encountered pandemics in my research on migration history, on general history, it just struck as being very odd because India did suffer tremendously from at least 3 pandemics in the 19th and early 20th century, what we call as the Cholera Pandemic, which came in many waves, the Plague Pandemic. So cholera is roughly from 1817 to 1920s across many waves, bacteria-based. The plague for about 25 years from 1897 to about the 1920s. And then, of course, the influenza pandemic of 1918-20. And so 3 major pandemics, which by my estimates killed about more than 70 million people around the world, of which 40 million were in India. So India was the epicenter of mortality, unfortunately, in all those 3 major pandemics. And when you see the newspaper articles of those times, it's just like it is today. You pick literally any newspaper from this century and somebody is talking about health. Because the defining enemy, in fact, more than the British or the Spanish or the French or empires fighting each other, basically it was, I think the fundamental enemy was not really political rivalries, but infectious disease. The life expectancy of Indians at this time we're talking about is in the early 20s, which means an average Indian born could expect to live only 20 years. After 1920, death rates in India start falling, and today we have a life expectancy of about 70 years. So this is a massive, improvement which has happened over the last 100 years. But this life expectancy not only was low to begin with, but it consistently fell in the late 19th century. So the first question to ask is, why was India affected so badly in these 3 pandemics? And this comes back to questions that we're asking today and what Mr. Godrich was pointing out of why India has done, compared to the Western world, better. Why is India, South Asia, Africa in terms of COVID mortality per capita? And of course, there are many hypotheses. But at least for cholera, we know it was endemic in Eastern India and it went around the world from Eastern India. For plague, most likely it came from China, stayed for about 25 years. And influenza came and went and nobody really knew what happened until 80 years later. People, deciphered what hit them. But if you see how the pandemics actually went around, obviously there was, some sort of movement of people, movement of vectors. What's also interesting is that these pandemics not only killed a lot of people, as these pandemics made their ways across India, they had a huge impact on the economy, on the society, on politics. I'll just come back to that in a minute. But I just want to point out that even back then, people were very amused by the regional variations. Just like we are struck by events of why is COVID mortality per capita so low in Bihar, say with respect to Maharashtra. And all sorts of hypotheses were given even then. So for cholera, the leading hypothesis by the late 19th century was the water-based transmission, which turned out to be the correct way, vis-a-vis air-based transmission, which was then later shown to be wrong. But for a long time, medical officials in India, for at least 40 years after John Snow had shown the waterborne transmission of cholera, medical officials in India believed that it was airborne. Right? And as cholera death rates started falling in Western Europe, they were actually increasing in India at this time. So you can clearly say there was kind of wrong policy or wrong acceptance of a particular scientific. These were scientists, these were medical doctors, British medical doctors in India, who refused to believe in this waterborne transmission, which was being proposed by a British scientist himself in England. It's a remarkable kind of, it kind of shows you about how steeped if you are in a scientific paradigm and refuse to accept different hypotheses, how much it can cost you. In the case of plague, between 1897 and 1905, people were completely clueless about what hit them. In fact, in Bombay City, after the first year, the municipal officials congratulated themselves, saying they had done a great job. And then plague continued to haunt Bombay, after for more than 25 years after that. The cities of Calcutta and Madras celebrated that they had, escaped from plague because of good policy management. It turned out later that the geography of plague was more related with the geography of rats and rat fleas once they understood how plague was actually transmitted. So again, you got those responses about regional variation, people thinking they'd done a great job, but actually it was the ecology of the disease which kind of mapped out onto why certain places of India got more plague than others. And the numbers were stark. Out of 13 million deaths, 12 million were in India alone, globally. And then there was influenza, 1918 to 20. In a few months of 1918, 20 million Indians died. That's a number which was larger than all the people in the world who died in World War I. And again, there was a massive drought. I think influenza, my argument in my book is that influenza worked on a drought, worked on undernutrition, and caused a lot of disease. Now, these pandemics, have left their legacies in a variety of ways, but surprisingly, we don't remember them. We've not really, there's documentation in those times, but unfortunately, there's not been enough of work, after that. And so we kind of forgotten them when COVID came back last year, or struck us last year. But I'll just, sum up in terms of some basic impacts. One is the economic impact. It had huge economic impact in terms of a lockdown. There was no lockdown, but an effective lockdown because simply people would not report to work if the epidemic was in the air. So even if the government did not clamp down, automatically nobody would be on the streets when the disease were in the air. So massive economic impacts. I document in my book the political impact. You can't understand India's freedom movement. For example, 1857 uprising was on the back of a cholera epidemic. The rise of the Congress against the backdrop of the plague, and the rise of Gandhi against the backdrop of the influenza pandemic of 1918. The labor movement, so many people died. It gave more bargaining power to workers. The labor movement in India was also a result of many of these pandemics. So these had multiple effects. It really transformed Indian society in various ways. And it's a pity that we've not kind of read enough or taught enough about our pandemics across in our history curriculums, in our medical schools, and hopefully that's one thing that can change. And it had a clear fallout on the migration crisis that we saw last year, on which we can have a discussion later.
Thank you, Professor Tumbe. So let me ask a question to Professor Vijay Chandru. Professor Chandru, epidemiology was in everyday parlance during this pandemic. What did India do well in interdisciplinary approaches to epidemiology, modeling, forecasting, surveillance, etc.?
Yes. So can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Sreejith and Sudhir, for putting this together and for inviting me to participate. Well, first, I'd like to say I'm really glad that we have Chinmay here, because as George Santayana famously said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Right. So I think the lessons in history are very important. But when we speak about a brief history of the next pandemic today, I think the horrors of the one we are in, and it isn't over yet, are fresh enough that we shouldn't need a reminder right now. Now, for the question, epidemiology, well, it's a classical discipline of the study of populations. It took a biostatistical shape in the early 20th century with the adoption of so-called compartment models, right? And the dynamical behavior of infections captured through simple ordinary differential equations. Surprisingly, after 100 years, this is still how epidemiology modeling is taught in clinical and public health programs. The idea of bringing data science and computer science methodologies to address modeling, forecasting, and surveillance has been happening. Initially in military research and biodefense at places like Los Alamos and so forth, which has now entered academic centers, like at the University of Virginia, where scientists trained in Los Alamos have become faculty leading these interdisciplinary efforts. Fortunately, some of our alumni from IIT Kanpur and IISc are key investigators at Virginia. So, like most professors, I learned a new interdisciplinary subject through my former PhD student, right? His name is Anil Kumar, and who is now at the Biocomplexity Institute in Virginia. And I've been teaching digital epidemiology in IISc since 2017. So a simple explanation of what this multidisciplinary shift is that the dynamics of infection spread is now modeled with synthetic agent-based populations, and the details of interactions between people at home, on the streets, in workplaces, in shopping malls, etc., are actually modeled in transportation systems, a very important aspect. So we model them using detailed interaction graphs, add contact tracing, for example, with Bluetooth and QR codes, and the detailing gets far more accurate and granular, right? To run the simulations and forecast for the use in surveillance and intervention decisions requires some computational heft, which is why you need data science expertise. Another discipline that has come in this year in particular, I mean, this pandemic in particular, has been genomics and genomic epidemiology. And that has something to do with the advancement in our capabilities with genome sequencing. But it's a terrific new contribution that we saw put to use in this pandemic. And a special shout out to Chitra Patabiraman at Nimhans, who also happens to be a former student of Sudhir's, um, uh, because she used pathogen sequencing to trace how variants came into Bangalore airport and then diffused into rural Karnataka. And so we actually had maps of which variant was going to which part of the state. And that's a whole new level of understanding of epidemiology, which was possible this time. I hope that brings out the various sort of multidisciplinarity aspects that have come into epidemiological analysis. And we'd right through this pandemic, we would hear of teams and collectives from around the country making forecasts and critiquing and improving models. And some outstanding examples to just mention were Rajesh Sundaresan and Sandeep Juneja from IISc and TIFR Mumbai, who actually modeled the cities of Bangalore and Mumbai at with almost 13 million agents. So they almost won, at least Bangalore, that more or less matched the population of the city. So one agent per person kind of granularity, and also actually going forward, we will see some very interesting new modeling approaches because Ashoka University, with Gautam Menon and others there, are now building a synthetic population model of 100 million agents. So you'd be able to model essentially countries with some level of accuracy. And then there have been efforts of various kinds. We are just about rolling out a platform that can keep campuses safe. Colleges are reopening, and we need to combine testing, tracing, and be able to advise on various decisions that can be made. That is on how movement from dorms to messes to labs to classrooms and so on can be simulated, and also you could change schedules and try to keep the students safe. And the testing methodologies have become so effective, and NCBS has also played a major role there, that we can now test at about and spend about 40 to 50 rupees per student per week, and actually be able to keep campuses safe, as long as the incidence of the infections don't get too high. So we're actually now able to build complete systems that can work for institutions, and going forward, I think for the next pandemic, I think we're certainly getting well prepared. So the punchline is that the realism in the models that allows us to make rational choices of effective control is really what these multidisciplinary approaches to epidemiology have made possible. And as far as the one that just seems to be ebbing, but the one we are in right now, we could have probably done better, but for sure, I think we're well prepared for the next epidemic.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Chandru. Thanks for giving us an overview of the new approaches to epidemiology. I'll come back to you. Before that, let me ask a question to Professor Tumbe. So you have been a scholar of the history of migration in the country. Again, this is your second book. And so one of the lasting memories of the human tragedy on our citizens by this pandemic was the mass migration. We have watched it in TV. And what could we have done better?
It's a good question, Sreejith. And of course, whatever I say now, one can say that this is hindsight bias. And of course, the decision making that was required in March would be very different from seeing it now. The fact that a lockdown was required is a view that I endorse. That some lockdown is obviously important, and the fact that by definition you cannot really all pandemics involve. A pandemic requires some migration, and to curtail a pandemic, you do require to curtail migration or some movement. But I think I see a big difference between internal migration and international migration. So that's my first point, that it's much easier to shut down international migration by just switching off your airport, switching off the airspace. And that's exactly what governments around the world did. But even there, remember, even we took some calibrated approach to shutting down our airspace between March 16th and March 24th. I clearly remember there was a graded approach towards shutting down our airspace. The UK government gave a week to its international students to go back home. And these students went back, and that's when they shut it down. With internal migration, it's much more tricky. When you don't have systems in place which can actually curtail mobility very quickly, what you will get is the inevitable migration, right? And it's remarkable that actually this is precisely what, in fact, the British, for all their other faults, saw through during the plague pandemic. So I'll just talk a little bit about two incidents of the past, one in which the railways was not shut down and one in which the railways was shut down. The British, while handling plague in India in the late 1890s, when it hit Bombay, they had to make a decision whether to shut down the railways or not. And they took the decision that we'll have special trains to ferry out migrant workers, just like our Shramik trains, during the plague. And the reasoning in the documentation that they left behind is that even if they shut down the trains, people would walk back home. This is there in the records of the British. And the reasoning was that circular migration is so present in India, 1 foot in the village, 1 foot in the city, that people will make these choices. In fact, what you heard on the railway station of Victoria Terminus back then in 1897 was this interesting line saying, "Agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge," which also tells you a cultural notion that if you want to die, you'd rather die in the village. And this is exactly what we heard last year. It's a remarkable kind of sense of insecurity when a health crisis hits a city. Fast forward to 1911, when the plague hit China in a very big way, the Chinese actually shut down their railways for their migrant workers, internal migration. And what you got in China in January 1911 was a humanitarian crisis, just like something similar to what we saw, where migrants started walking back home. It was a winter in China, people died of the cold rather than the disease. So we have two examples from history of these choices which were made, all of which says when you shut down internal migration, you have to get two things right. One is if the disease is already out of hand, then you better ensure a lot of social security provisioning to migrants because you're telling them to stay where you are. Right? But in India, when we told people to stay at home for more than 100 million migrant workers who are circular in nature in India. Home means village. Right? When you say stay at home, it means actually go back to the village. So from the psychological perspective of the migrants, it was very obvious, it was a very rational choice that they started, going back home. The difference between, what happened during the plague and now is, of course, that the special trains arrived, but they arrived 2 months late. So the specific question of what we should have done, differently, I do think that in the middle of March last year, we did have at least a few days or a week to allow the migrant workers to go back. Now, again, and I've written about this in that time, so this is, again, not, hindsight bias. Now, you could, of course, criticize this, saying that, the whole point of stopping the railways was to prevent the transmission of the virus across India. Maybe things would have been worse, etc. But I do think, like the British had said back home, it would eventually happen, in the sense it is impossible to shut down internal movement. When you shut down international transport, people cannot swim or fly from UK to India, but people can always walk back. What we saw last year is, when you shut down the state borders, they went to the state borders and they just walked down, the checkpost, and they just crossed some fields and then continued. It's virtually impossible. The only way one can really clamp down is if you provide, free food, free shelter, free everything for at least for many months on end. Now, that eventually happened many weeks down the line, but there was no real communication for migrant workers in the lockdown speech. We kind of lost an important 1 or 2 weeks in the communication process. So any policymaker has to make the decision. Do we shut it down right now, or do we shut it down a week later? I would say, given the situation that we have in India with more than 100 million circular migrant workers, maybe give the option for people to go back. If you can't do that, then just go all out and have a massive communication saying, the state will take care of everything, all your needs. You don't have to go back home for the next 3 or 4 months. The problem in this lockdown was also the credibility of when the lockdown would end. Many migrants had the holding capacity for a few weeks. And when the Prime Minister said 3 weeks, they said 3 weeks. But then it became 1 week more, it became 1 week more. And that is when the crisis really intensified, because a lot of migrants said this is never going to end. And because there's so many daily wage workers, the financial insecurity was so great, a lot of people started walking back home. A very rational choice. I just end by pointing out an analogy. I was stuck in the Bombay floods, Mumbai floods of 2005, and I had to walk about 3 kilometers back home. And I was stuck in a place where the water was rising, and I had to make a choice: whether do I walk back in this 3 kilometers in this knee-length water, or do I stay where I am and take a chance as to how high the water will rise. And eventually, most of us in that particular area decided to walk back home. So it's a risk walking back through floodwaters, but there's a security that you know that when you get home, things will be fine. And it's the proverbial kind of waters rising to your neck where you're standing. And for the migrants, this was not water, but financial hardship, economic hardship, starvation. And so that's really what drove this migration crisis. So the two big lessons is, maybe give the option for migrant workers to go back home. If that is not feasible, if the virus is already out of hand and you think things are going to make worse, you have a backstop arrangement saying that everything will be free in terms of food, basic provisions for the next 3 months. I think that is the minimum that we can do next time around.
Thank you, Mr. Tumbe. We will get back to you with for further discussion on that topic. Let me ask a question to Professor Vijay Chandru. I mean, as the panel shows, we are people from multiple disciplines. The epidemic has kind of shown the need for interaction between different professions, scientists, social scientists, doctors, epidemiologists, etc. So is there an emergent new science that this pandemic has shown the need for, which can answer which can help us answer a lot of questions which earlier was not possible?
Thank you. That's a fairly challenging question, and I will try to address some aspects of it. To some extent, I will revert to my scientific or technological sort of foundations, because I don't know that I have the competence to address across multiple disciplines like social science and so on. But wars and pandemics are usually drivers for major shifts in science and technology, and I can see some interesting pivotal sort of things that will happen, as a result of this. Um, what was the big word uh, to think about, uh, this last year? Uh, it was immunity, the word immunity, right? And if you do a Google trend analysis of the word immunity, what you will see is that around March or April, there's a huge spike, right? It goes up maybe 7, 8 times the frequency of the use of the word immunity. And then it gradually tapers down, but it stays at about 3, 4 times the level that it was before the start of the pandemic. And it has stayed steady, right? So that suggests to us that there's a shift that's going to happen. There is a huge focus on immunity, and you hear words like innate immunity, herd immunity, all kinds of uses of immunity. And, certainly in the consumer sector, now every product has a label that says, immune booster, right, on it, no matter what it does. So I think immunity has really caught everyone's imagination. And particularly things like innate immunity are certainly going to raise questions about things like the hygiene hypothesis, also traditional knowledge. And you heard people right through say, I didn't give up on my chavanprash or whatever, that I was protecting myself with various traditional remedies and knowledge to boost my immunity and so on. So I think that's a very serious investigation that will start now, that we will see traditional knowledge which has been in some ways, from an AI perspective, you can think of traditional knowledge as the knowledge gained through longitudinal data sets and have been learned through longitudinal data sets. And that knowledge now has to be somehow integrated with modern ways of thinking, with data-driven science, and to actually come up with very new methodologies. And I think we will see some of that certainly happening. Immunology itself, and was already becoming an important subject, and in cancer treatment, in cancer care, because certainly we've had a shift from targeted therapies into immunologics. So there's certainly been a shift there. And studying immunity has been important, and of course in the context of the vaccines and what it does to the immune system, how there has been seen a lot of heterogeneity in response to therapeutics, to vaccines, to the infection itself. And just trying to understand all of that is going to require a great focus on immunology. And I think that focus will actually come from a discipline that's been in the making for a while now, which the academic name for it is systems biology, right? And systems immunology, I think, is probably the name for this new subject that's going to develop. And there's bioinformatics and there was systems biology, and there's a distinction between the two, which is subtle but important. I think bioinformatics is more about gathering data, visualizing data, just being able to do some basic analysis of the data. And systems biology was actually the semantic part. How do you actually make get the meaning out of it? How do you interpret it? How do you build models and so on? And while 10 years ago, we used to think of bioinformatics as big data, no theory, and systems biology as big theory, no data, right? But our ability to measure and our instrumentation capabilities and so on have gotten to a point now where I think we can aspire to big data, big theory, right? And that's what it's going to need to get to systems immunology. So that's certainly another shift and multidisciplinarity that will have to come in, and and of course now you will have to build teams that are that are multidisciplinary in this sense that you bring together you know technologists, clinicians, bioinformaticians, and immunological expertise, all under one roof and one program to really understand and move forward on this. I'd also like to point out that there's been a couple of important landmarks that we hit last year, which again, might have a great bearing on how research goes forward. And one is, many people have noticed this, that of course the historians of science will note that the vaccine response in 2020 was one of the most significant scientific developments, right? The fact that from the sequence of the pathogen to a vaccine that was approved could happen in less than 12 months is unique. I mean, you look at every other infectious disease and how long it's taken. There have also been some development of new techniques, the nucleic methodologies for vaccine development, and I think so. We're that's going to be a turning point of how we can think of addressing many disorders with rapid vaccine development now going forward. And of course, that will have a lot of social implications. And, so you'll have to have the social sciences come in and, address, some of the vaccine resistance issues and so on, which have to be looked at very carefully. The other interesting development last year, and I think with all the things going on with the pandemic that was probably not looked at that carefully, was the development of AlphaFold, right? In some sense, the pinnacle of artificial intelligence has been reached, right? I don't really buy into the anthropomorphic view of robots taking over and so on, right? Humanoid robots and so forth. So I think the two big challenges in front of AI were facial recognition, okay, which it solved, and a problem like protein folding, right, which it also has solved, right? And the fact that you can actually design proteins now and test whether they fold or not and how well they fold is a landmark, right? And I think we haven't really understood what that means, but that's also going to change science and how we think about science going forward. And so I believe that at least in my mind, and as far as impact on science is concerned, the role of AI is over, right? So in some sense, the second machine age is over, and we've reached that pinnacle now. And what is coming next is, of course, NCBS always thinks of the right names in advance. We're entering the age of living machines, right? And of course, NCBS has a center for living machines. So the age of living machines is an exciting new phase, and I think it's being defined as we speak. And there's a wonderful book by Susan Hockfield, the former president of MIT, with that title. I would urge all of you to read it. I think it's very exciting, and it'll be the coming together of engineering and biology. I think the biology sort of went through this whole evolution of parts building, making the parts list. Then it got into bioinformatics, which gave the software to put the parts list together, and now we're actually getting into real bioengineering, which I think will be very exciting and could bring about many changes. So I'll stop there. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Chandru. Let me invite Dr. Gauri Divan and Mr. Nadir Godrej also into the panel. And I'd like to request the audience to, if they have any questions, please send in your questions via the Q&A box. So let me start with a question to Mr. Nadir Godrej. Mr. Godrej, you are a doyen of Indian industry. Private enterprise played an important role the last 1 year in testing and and even designing and developing vaccines. Do you see areas where private enterprise could have done better, or are there areas where we can achieve more in terms of private industries?
Right. I think the private sector was not allowed to do much in certain fields, like vaccination was first done by government hospitals. It might have been better to allow the private sector in earlier. Even testing was not allowed to the private sector right in the beginning. So there is a lot that the private sector can do. It's understandable that the government wanted to do a lot of things free, and it's difficult for the private sector to do things free. So those mechanisms are difficult to evolve. We were discussing about how rapidly vaccines were developed, as Dr. Chandru pointed out. The interesting thing is that the vaccines themselves were developed in 1 or 2 months. It took 10 to 11 months to test them. So the next big breakthrough is going to be non-human testing of vaccines. We can develop protocols that are sure that the vaccines are safe, at least, if not effective. Then we could have emergency approvals very, very fast. And for handling a future pandemic, trying to develop a vaccine in 2 months would be much better than developing a vaccine in 11 months. And with all that we discussed about big data and big theory, perhaps we can find these testing methods that don't require human beings.
Thank you very much. May I ask Dr. Divan a question? Dr. Divan, as a pediatrician and a public health practitioner, what do you sense is the pandemic's impact on children?
So thank you not only for the question, but really having me on this really very interesting panel, very diverse and just very interesting. And I would have loved to hear much more from them. But let me just kind of say something which is obviously obvious, quite obvious to everybody, that children, first of all, do not live in isolation. And hence, there's been a knock-on effect of the pandemic and the associate lockdown on all children across all ages and all countries, across all levels of society. So I think we just have to accept that this impact of the pandemic has actually been huge. And I just want to talk about maybe 3 areas which I think I'd like to focus on. And the first area is the emotional impact of the pandemic. And I think this was really compounded by what I would say, as somebody working in the field, as a complete lack of clear, simple, responsive communication, which could allow families, all families, particularly those of low literacy, to explain the pandemic to all children. And I think what happened because of this lack of communication, we all had to shift to potentially the most unreliable of sources, which is the media. And so most information that we now seem to get, even around the vaccine, is really through ways that are not clear and simple. And this, as a result, built up levels of anxiety in not only families and through the porosity of children to all children. And so when you look at younger children, I would say the kind of impacts we've had are regression of milestones. In older children, we've had behavioral problems. And I think with adolescents, who really have some very unique vulnerabilities, we've seen a lot of loneliness and isolation. So this would really be the kind of broad level impacts on young people. Not to forget that in many households, these are exacerbated. And the kind of things that put children even more at risk is when you have a parent with a mental health problem, when you are in lockdown in an environment where there's increasing domestic violence because families and mothers cannot just get out, when you have youth with inherent vulnerabilities, and I would really say young people with disability are really most at risk. So these are the kind of kids who've really had to grapple with the emotional impacts of the pandemic and its lockdown. The next really would be social. So I would see that as another area of impact. And the reason for the social impact is really that what the pandemic and the lockdown is, it really fractured children from a very key developmental activity. And what is the key development activity of all children, most children, I would say beyond the first 2 years of life and into adolescence, is really meeting peers and interacting with peers. So this is really what young people need, is they need to meet each other, particularly as they grow, they learn a lot from each other. And this was taken away. Within this context, where do most young people meet each other is in schools. And schools are really a safe place from many homes. They not only provide a safe environment, they provide routines, but for almost 100 million children in the context of India, they provide the one meal that they're going to get. So this is another huge impact on young people. And finally, because the kind of impact of school closure is also academic. And in this way, I would say that young children suddenly are really worried about their future. And they're worried about their future in two ways. There are young people who just don't know whether they're going to be jobs anymore. And I think there's particularly the future now, which we're handing over to young people, which is where the environment has been degraded to a level which is really quite immense. Because, the story around the pandemic is that it comes because we're degrading our environment. It's jumped from animal hosts to human hosts. So I think the sudden understanding for young people that it is something beyond their control is really increasing anxieties in this age group. So let me just end there, kind of thinking about these three areas. But actually, let me just add one more issue around school closure. And I'd like to say this because we had International Women's Day yesterday. And I think one of the big successes in India has really been our ability to bring young adolescent girls into school through that schooling process to give them the opportunity for work. As a result, delay the age of marriage, which we know has a huge impact on intergenerational economics and health. And I think what has happened is this particular group now is totally at risk because many young girls have just been pulled out of school. And one is very hopeful, but one is not particularly sure about how many children at risk in these very fragile homes are actually going to come back into education. So let me end there.
Thank you, Dr. Divan. So what could be some remedial actions that can be taken now to help them cope with these stressful memories once things get back to normal?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is also difficult and, we're such a diverse country, but again, I would look at the school unit as being one really where, it is a safe place. We are hoping that children are going to be back in school at the next term. And unfortunately, in the context of where we live, school in India just means academic excellence. We only talk about curriculum. We talk about finishing curriculum, things like life sciences, circle time, developing mental health policies, etc., really get laid on the side. So I would say that if there is something urgent we need to do for this particular generation, it's really thinking about how do we transform schools to promote mental health. And this will mean not only developing modules or adapting modules, because many of these modules are already available, bringing them into classrooms as soon as possible, supporting administrators, teachers, allied staff into school to support young people as they come back into school to really take stock of what this last 12 months has meant to them. Allowing younger children to draw, slightly older children to talk, to write, to diarize, and to really explain and bring out these experiences of what has it meant in their particular experience of these last 12 months of the pandemic. I think that would be really important, because I think unless we allow young people to speak, we are not going to be able to design solutions which are going to support them for the future.
Thank you. So on the question of schools and technology, so we have seen a lot of technology usage. Classes are now conducted online. It's like that. I am reminded of a talk by Mr. Godrich, where he had talked about using technology in schools. So I would like to ask, so you have seen this increase of use of technology in school education now, maybe for good or for bad. But do you see this remaining even after we go back to normalcy? Are things going to be online and offline mixed, for example?
So if you're asking me, I'm going to just jump in very quickly and say that let's just be very realistic. Almost 2/3 of children in this country don't have access to digital studying. So this is a very privileged access. Even the children who have access through one family phone, parents are absolutely struggling to understand what they're expected their children to do. So we have a huge swath of children who learn in households where they're first-generation learners. And so I would say that I think we should think about technology, how to leverage it without a doubt, but keeping in mind that there are huge numbers that technology has left behind. So let's not, consider technology as this little solution. Sorry to be a kind of negative on a Zoom call, which is bringing us together on technology. But I think that's really the reality of this country. And I think if we truly want progress, we have to design for this country and for every child and for every citizen. So,
thank you. Let me take a few questions from the audience. Okay, here's a question to Professor Chandru. So you're talking about epidemiology and models of epidemiology. Now, so that's in particular for the pandemic, right? So, but do you see, can you see a computational epidemiology be integrated into day-to-day public health and healthcare even post the pandemic?
Well, actually, computational epidemiology has been far more actively developed for influenzas and and it's been used extensively for modeling and for interventions with flu vaccines and so forth. And in many of the Western countries, of course, the flu is a pretty devastating sort of epidemic that happens. And some interesting things developed, like Google developed a methodology called flu trends, which by just tapping into social media, you can actually get a sense of where the hotspots are and how the epidemic is evolving. And this goes on. I mean, this is so at the University of Virginia, the Biocomplexity Institute, they're constantly monitoring every infection or health challenge that is happening. So I think once we have this infrastructure in place, this should just become routine surveillance. And I think we need to incorporate this into our public health infrastructure. And I hope that will happen, and it will not just be a one-time use of these technologies.
Thank you. So this was a question by Pratik. I hope Pratik you got the answer. So okay, here is a question by one of the students. Okay, so a student wants to. I mean, this can be taken by any one of you. Okay, so student wants to, Kushi Bhatnagar wants to know. You have been a lot of areas you have been talking about which are important for our society. How much as students, can they venture into these areas? How can they get into all these areas? Is what Kushi Bhatnagar wants to. So, any one of you can.
Sreejith, can I come in for a minute?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
No, I just introduced Jitu Mayer is also on the panel. Jitu, you don't have to wait till the end. You can just join in on the panel. So maybe you can start with getting into this question that Sreejith just posed about students and then take it from there.
Sure, Sudhir, thanks. But you know, the other panelists are probably more qualified than I to answer that question. So, you know, I would like to hear from what they have to say. And then I had some questions for our really extraordinary speakers of today that I'll come to after they answer this question.
Okay.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
So maybe I can come in, you know, just as a very practical thing about young people and how can young people participate. So I have to say I was very privileged. I was stuck in a lockdown in Goa, which is probably a nice place to be stuck down as a privileged person. Though, of course, we ourselves had a huge othering of people, which Chinmay knows very well. So, the migrant population in Goa was also othered very quickly through the hard lockdown that we had. But I think what was very reassuring was to see actually, so in the context of Goa villages, you have youth groups. And so many of these youth groups actually got together. So I'm going to talk about what you can do more from a practical point of view and not from getting into the field, which I think somebody like Vijay might be much more accomplished at answering. And I would say that really what we need is, and this could also be, what are the next steps? And I think for me, one thing that struck me about the success of these groups at the level of villages was really any future building back for any kind of disaster management plan must have young people participating in it. Because these are really the young people on the ground. They're enthusiastic, they have the energy, they're quick thinking, they want to solve problems. And I think if we can bring them to the table for any future planning, any future suggestions to how to make this participatory and create in some way, community level groups which are non-political, non-secular, secular, non-political, but led by peers. I think it would just be a very exciting model to support, vulnerable people within a community. So we had groups supporting isolated old people, people with disability, migrant groups by collecting food, etc., getting people to medication. So I really feel that there is something besides the education track that if we can make sure that our young people keep in touch with, I think we just have a much more empathetic country.
So in case the question was about epidemiology, I think let me just answer.
It was.
To say that, there was a famous cartoon out a few months back, which basically someone walks into a bookstore and the bookstore manager just calls out and says, if you're looking for books on epidemiology, go to self-help. Right? so there's really a lot of stuff out there. You can really teach yourself a lot of epidemiology if you basically have an inclination to math and statistics and can do a little computing. It's something that you can really learn pretty well off the internet.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and ask question?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah, I'll actually, it's a question for Chinmay. And, Chinmay, really fabulous perspective that you provided about the migration and impact on the migrations. But surely, and this is a question that's been in many of our minds, surely policymakers would have been aware of exactly the kind of concerns that you brought up, right? What is the explanation that we can give or can have for this enormous impact that we have seen? Is it a complete letdown from policymakers or a complete abdication of responsibility? Or I mean, what do you, I mean, how do you see this? I mean, given also your historical perspective.
Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, I served on this current government's working group on migration, and we came out with a report in 2017 outlining the numbers and the precisely what has to be done for migrant workers. So all the more baffling. I think at one level, migrant workers, especially interstate migrant workers, are completely invisibilized in India. In fact, if this migration crisis had not happened, I mean, one of the very strange paradoxes, for the first time we are talking about migrant workers, is precisely because people have seen them, walking out of the streets, as somebody said, as middle class India was watching Ramayana, actual people were being banished from our cities outside. So this is a very painful sort of moment, and this invisibilization happens at multiple levels. It happens at the political level because migrants rarely vote in the destination regions; they were voting in the source regions. So they're not a constituency to be worried about. So there is a general lack of statistics, otherwise people would know migrants because you're a vote bank. Right? So if you're not going to vote, you're not really going to come into this public good ambit. So we don't have good statistics in our cities of where migrants are, how many they are. So that was the first thing. I used to get a lot of calls from state government saying, tell us how many migrants are there in your state, because they have to arrange these things about migrant transport and so on. So that is a fundamental problem on statistics, real-time statistics, general invisibilization. So I don't know what this decision-making was between, say, the week leading up to March 24th. But I think somebody should have said, it would have impacted migrant workers. Maybe they did think about migrant workers, but they said maybe they can survive for a few weeks. And then if the thinking was that only 21 days are required, maybe the reasoning was that if it's only 21 days, then maybe we can just have an abrupt lockdown. So that was maybe a miscalculation of how long such a thing would take. Maybe that was a thing. There could also be a rationale that if the virus spreads back, I think this was the benevolent idea that if the virus does go into rural areas, it would be much harder to curb it there. Right? And the fact that healthcare facilities are much worse off in rural India than urban India. And so the idea was to let's keep the people where they are. I think somehow that kind of got slipped into the policymakers forum. Having said that, I think even after imposing the lockdown on March 24th, I do think we could have learned much quicker. If we saw how it played out until the Shramik train started on May 1st, this is really a 25-day major humanitarian crisis. I think there's still many levels in which we failed. Very quickly, the migrants actually didn't stop blaming the central government. They started blaming state governments because each state government said, we are not going to take you back. Right? And so it very quickly fell out onto the state governments. So migrant workers were blaming each state government, saying, why aren't you taking us back, and so on. So the only thing we can say is that, going forward, some of the good things that the government is now doing is, for example, this one nation, one ration card idea, the idea of, giving portable social security, but ration is only one element. I think we need to have a system where you can have, social security accessible anywhere in India, irrespective of your place of residence. And I think not just ration, but education, health, just a variety of services, insurance, etc. So that should be our goal. But again, to answer you specifically, just last week, the Haryana government passed a law that 75% of jobs will be reserved for locals. And I think that kind of tells you really the larger story, that inherently, at some level, our kind of focus has been anti-migrant. And so I've just written an op-ed piece in today's Indian Express, about why this law is anti-constitutional. And even this law will hit eventually interstate migrant workers. So somewhere down the line, we have taken these two views. One is we've kind of this Gandhian view that people should stay in villages, we should develop rural areas so nobody comes to urban areas. I feel that that's not practical. It's going to happen. And on that view, then migrants are not really politically seen, because they don't have really, they're not really voting in elections. So it's truly an invisible class of workers. And I think that's really the reason how it slipped through. And hopefully the main learning from this pandemic is that, this should never, ever happen again.
Right. I mean, 100 million invisible.
Yeah.
Larger than most countries in the world. Yeah. So the other thing I sort of wanted to raise for Vijay, for Chandru, is Chandru, you mentioned this, that we have seen the most extraordinary, uh, application of science in building up vaccines. But I should add that this hasn't happened overnight. I mean, the question also we could ask is why hasn't the same happened for other diseases? Because the technology at the beginning of March is no different for other diseases like cholera, TB. So why haven't we seen that sort of an effort in that direction? So again, I think it's a question of what is the preparedness that we are talking about. The preparedness was there, and that preparedness has sort of been built up over years and decades of research. And I mean, it's amazing that it came together for the pandemic, but it could have also come together for other diseases. So I just sort of
you're absolutely right, Jitu, about this. That the mRNA technology has been around since 2010, 2011. Boston Children's Hospital had developed it initially for various cell-related treatments. So I think the answer is completely economic, and Andy Lowe at Sloan School has a very good explanation. The economic model is broken, right, for Western pharmaceuticals. Making a vaccine and then selling it at $5 a pop is really completely unviable. And they have no margins at all in doing it because of the way they run. Their entire business model is based on $100,000 cancer drugs and not $5 vaccines, right? While our Indian pharma industry is actually built on, thriving on a $5 vaccine, right? So that's where you saw India's readiness, and and if you really want to change this, you have to change the economic model, the business models that pharma companies run on. Because you're right, there is absolutely no reason why this kind of rapid response is not possible for every disorder. But the economic model has to work, and there's a misalignment. I was part of the World Economic Forum's Industry Advisory Council on the future of health, and this was the one thing we came up with, that there's a complete misalignment between the players, and so why will you only work on cancer drugs? Because insurance will pay, and you can make or you can make some orphan drug that on which you're allowed to charge $2.1 million per patient, which is what the Zolgensma, the new drug for spinal muscular atrophy that Novartis has put out, and that is that's the economic model that pharma companies are built on. And so we need more Indian like pharma companies to become, to have this work better. Yeah.
Thanks, Chandru.
Thank you. May I ask a question to Professor Mr. Nadir Godrej? The pandemic has kind of destroyed the economy in many ways. How do you see the? So currently things are getting back on time. From the industry perspective, do you see things are going back to normal, business as normal, and how fast do you see things getting back as usual?
Yeah, you can divide industries into three groups: those that benefit from COVID, those that are more or less neutral to COVID, and those that get very badly hit by COVID. Those that are very badly hit by COVID are the obvious ones: travel and hospitality and restaurants and things like that. Those that benefit are Zoom, and the pharmaceutical sector, the vaccine manufacturers, they're all big beneficiaries of the pandemic. And I hope that they learn lessons for the future, as Dr. Chandru was pointing out. And maybe the Indian industry can develop vaccines for other diseases with their economics by collaborating with universities wherever they are in the world, as they did with Oxford and AstraZeneca to develop the Covishield. So these industries have benefited from it. And many industries like consumer products and so on were affected badly, as I mentioned in my poem, in April and May, but very quickly recovered. The most difficult thing was getting factories going. It was very easy to get offices running, thanks to all the industries like Zoom that benefited from the pandemic. So India is definitely on the recovery path now, and I think even hotels and travel will start recovering soon.
Thank you. Mr. Godrej, maybe you missed mentioning Netflix also.
Yes, yes, and Amazon, all of them. I'm sorry I only mentioned Zoom because it's immediately in front of us.
Right. Maybe we will close the session by a final question to each of the other panel members. So I would like to bring in Dr. Divan in, and I would want to ask, how can we build back our lives better, especially those who have gone through a bad case scenario during the pandemic?
So thank you. That's a really big question, and maybe I'm just going to again talk about it from the point of view of thinking really about. I think as we've got these great technocrats on this call, and who are really on the cutting edge, particularly in the institutes that are represented here, IIT, NCBS, etc. I think it's really important, increasingly in social sciences, we're really thinking about how do we bring in the voices of the people. And I think this is just, we've got a great opportunity now to really do some of this work. I think what Chinmay described is, I think we heard this many times. It was not about a past pandemic either. It was about, if we want to die, we want to die in our villages because we want to be with people who love us, who will respect our bodies, etc. And I think the biggest thing for most people is that we just want to be respected in life and in death. And I think if we can just have that model across the age groups, that how do we respect young children? How do we respect people with disability? And how do we bring their perspectives into any future design, I think is really essential. So that's really for me, how do we become just much more participatory and not just kind of tokenism that, okay, let's have a couple of focus groups, but actually listen to these voices, listen to these experiences, and really think about what these experiences mean for a new disaster management plan or a pandemic preparedness plan that we want to develop. And that would really just be my kind of plea to people, thinking about, the next steps.
Thank you. Maybe may I ask a question to Professor Tumbe? This is not something you mentioned, but this is kind of the overarching topic of our discussion. So it's kind of, Professor Chandru also mentioned that about an interdisciplinary need. From a social science perspective, do you see a need for interacting with for other disciplines like clinicians and scientists, etc., even after the pandemic, we are back to our normal lives?
I think, I think, for example, let me take just history as a discipline. I mean, we tend to think of, we love to talk about history, but we actually do very little to document it. I mean, Godrich has a wonderful archives. NCBS has a wonderful, actually, I'm talking to all, institutions which have wonderful archives. It's a coincidence. But in general, archiving is, not done. And believe it or not, Vijay was saying that, this pandemic is there in our memory. 30 years down the line, it might still be in our memories, but we're all going to die off. 50 years down the line, 60 years down the line, and if there's no pandemic in the interim, we'll be back to square one. We'll still have this migration crisis. We'll be back So we need to also document, very well what's happening now. Maybe have, I think, the Lancet Commission reports, have some systematic documentation, which hopefully some future government, 60 years down the line, builds on. And I think building this collective memory is very important. That's one of the reasons I've written this book, is to tell us something about the past. So just, history, social sciences. One of the things I found out, even in epidemiology, I learned it when I was learning mapping about John Snow and the cholera map and so on. In my book, I show this map of, villages. And there's a medical office in the late 19th century who was showing, a particular caste group stays on one side of the village and another caste group stays on another side of the village. And cholera was only at, in one part of the village where the wells were there. Right? And this is a guy using a caste level, variation to tell us something about, transmission and disease. And kind of again told me that, you need to take into account so many realities when we start talking about India, Indian society, how it lives. In talk of transmission in cities, you have to understand how people live in slums, etc. So a huge scope, I think, for scientists and people in social studies. I don't like to call it social sciences, as many people do. I don't think it's really a science. So social studies and this the science world, I think, definitely needs much more interaction, and definitely the policy making. Like, I don't think this migration crisis was completely needed. There's no reason it would have happened if, I think, there was room full of epidemiologists, economists, people who worked on migration. All of them put into it. So definitely, I think, much more power for interdisciplinarity going forward.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Tumbe. I'll ask final question to Professor Vijay Chandru. This is kind of probably your area, like talk about computation. So, so you're talking about this agent-based model and different epidemiological models. So it's all based on, because of the huge computational power, right? How much do you see, can computational power, so these are very high dimensional or a lot of parameters, issues, social parameters, and also like the parameters of virus, how it spreads, etc. And there are a lot of parameters, and a lot of data. Do you see that computationally, these are all, it's possible to predict better? For example, for the next pandemic, let's say, we can predict how fast it spreads, etc. better.
I believe so. I do believe that the accuracy and the integrity of the models have been now, they've been calibrated quite well, and we will be able to get slightly or substantially better forecasts, and our ability to plan will improve. But I think that's a dry note to end on, and let me pick up a little bit on what Chinmay and Gauri said, because I think even in a computational and purely sort of technological view of this whole thing, I do think we do need that multidisciplinary interaction with history, the interaction with the dignity of citizens, and I think I think the whole ethics of how we use technologies like contact tracing, and and the ethics of bias that might be introduced by artificial intelligence methods and so on. We do need to evolve now into to understand better how to build solutions which take into consideration all these multiple facets. And I think one of the challenges that we have faced as computational epidemiologists in going into even campuses, even technology campuses around the country, is that the ethics committees, by and large, are not that familiar with what to do about these computational methodologies, because ethics committees have primarily been set up for biological experiments or clinical experiments. And so, this whole issue of how ethics should deal with computational models, I think, and data is a brand new thing. And even from a governance point of view, I think the nation is grappling with the whole issue of governance on data. So I think there's definitely scope for multidisciplinarity in every one of the topics we've touched on today. So thank you.
So thank you, everyone. Let's thank the panelists, Professor Tumbe, Chandru, Mr. Godrej, Dr. Divan. We're very lucky to have this diverse panel. It's a wonderful learning experience. At least I learned a lot. Here we heard different viewpoints. And I would also like to thank the audience for attending the session and engaging with us, asking questions. Thank you all very much. Thanks. Thanks once again to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.